remained in the hospital for nearly a year. His spinal cord was severed. He would never walk again. Johnnie Wilder, a return to singing marked a new phase of his musical journey. For Heatwave, it marked the beginning of the end.
London, 1977, and a disco-funk band called Heatwave is about to own the summer. Boogie Nights, climbing to number 2 in the UK, number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100. Platinum plaques stacking up faster than they can hang them. The Wilder brothers, Johnnie and Keith, had the kind of vocals that made you believe in something, and Rod Temperton was writing songs so smooth they'd later fuel Michael Jackson's Thriller. They were supposed to be the next big thing, and for a minute they were, but before the debut album even dropped, guitarist Jesse Whitten was stabbed to death on a Chicago street. A year later, bassist Mario Mantese got knifed by his girlfriend at a party, slipped into a coma, woke up blind and paralyzed. Then, in 1979, Johnnie Wilder's car got smashed by a van, paralyzed from the neck down, confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. 3 tragedies in 3 years, and the groove line went silent. The world moved on, the hits faded, and Heatwave became a footnote in disco history, remembered more for what happened to them than what they created. This is the story of the band that wouldn't die, until fate made sure it did. Before the knives and the crashes, before the wheelchairs and the funerals, there were 2 brothers from Dayton, Ohio, who believed music could take them somewhere their hometown never could. Johnnie Wilder Jr. was born July 3, 1949, in a working-class neighborhood where dreams were practical and ambition was measured in steady paychecks, not spotlights. His younger brother Keith came along 2 years later in Chicago, but the family settled back in Dayton, where both boys grew up singing in church, harmonizing in the kitchen, imagining stages they'd never seen. Johnnie had that frontman energy, the kind of presence that made people turn their heads even when he wasn't trying. Keith had the voice to match, smooth and soulful, the kind that could carry a ballad or ignite a dance floor. But Dayton wasn't built for their kind of fire, so Johnnie did what a lot of young black men did back then when options felt limited. He enlisted. The U.S. Army stationed him in Germany in the early 70s, and it was there, surrounded by military bases and European nightlife, that the vision clicked. He started recruiting musicians through classified ads, pulling together a mix of American expats and local talent, building something that didn't exist yet, a sound that blended the groove and grit of American soul with the polished, synthesized edge of European production. It was ambitious, maybe even a little reckless, but Johnnie had never been the type to play it safe. By 1975, he'd convinced Keith to join him, and together they moved the operation to London, the city where disco was exploding and record labels were hungry for the next big thing. They recruited session players, refined the lineup, started rehearsing like their lives depended on it, because in a way, they did. This wasn't a hobby or a side hustle. This was the dream. The one shot at building something bigger than themselves, something that could outlast the factory shifts and corner store gigs back home. They had the sound, they had the brothers, they had the vision. All they needed was one song to make the world listen. That song arrived in 1976 in a London studio that smelled like cigarette smoke and ambition, courtesy of a label called GTO Records. GTO was part of the EMI machine, and they had a house producer named Barry Blue who knew how to polish rough demos into radio gold. Blue heard something in Heatwave's energy, the way Johnnie and Keith's vocals locked together, the way the rhythm section could make you move without even trying. And he paired them with a quiet keyboardist named Rod Temperton, who'd been scribbling songs in notebooks for years, waiting for his moment. Temperton wasn't flashy, wasn't trying to be the star, but the man could write a hook that burrowed into your brain and refused to leave. He'd been working on something called Boogie Nights, a disco-funk anthem that felt like summer and sweat and freedom all wrapped into 4 minutes of pure groove. The session was electric, Johnny's voice riding the bass line, Keith harmonizing in the pocket, the synths shimmering like neon lights on a wet street. When they played it back, everyone in the room knew they had something special. GTO rushed it to radio, and by January 1977, Boogie Nights was climbing the UK charts like it had wings, peaking at number 2 and refusing to let go. The song jumped the Atlantic, hit number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100, went platinum before anyone could catch their breath. April 1977 brought the debut album, Too Hot to Handle, and it landed at number 11 on the Billboard 200, number 5 on the R&B charts. Platinum certification stacking up like validation they'd waited their whole lives to feel. The momentum was dizzying. Sold-out shows, press interviews, radio spins on every major station. They performed at an MLK birthday tribute in front of 16,000 screaming fans. The kind of crowd that makes you believe you finally made it, that the struggle was worth it, that nothing can touch you now. Johnnie and Keith stood on that stage, sweat dripping under the lights, feeling like kings. And for a minute, they were. The industry that had ignored them, the doors that had stayed closed, the labels that had passed, all of it felt like ancient history. They had the hits, they had the plaques, they had the world dancing to their rhythm. But while the record climbed the charts, back in Chicago, one of their own was about to become a headline for all the wrong reasons. Jesse Whitten was the kind of guitarist who made it look easy, fingers dancing across frets like he was born with strings attached to his soul. He was from Chicago, had known the streets since he was a kid, and when Johnnie recruited him for Heatwave, he brought that raw, bluesy edge that made the disco grooves hit harder. His playing was the backbone of Boogie Nights, the rhythm guitar licks that made people move without thinking. He wasn't the frontman, wasn't chasing the spotlight, but anyone who knew music knew Jesse was essential. In 1977, before Too Hot to Handle even finished its victory lap on the charts, Jesse went back home to Chicago for a break. Maybe it was family, maybe it was old friends, maybe it was just the pull of home after months on the road and in London studios. But whatever brought him back to those streets, he never made it out alive. The details are sparse, the kind of tragedy that gets reduced to a single line in an obituary. Stabbed to death on a Chicago street, another young black man gone too soon. No big headlines, no deep investigations, just a phone call that shattered a rehearsal room thousands of miles away. The band got the news mid-session, and the studio went silent. Johnnie and Keith stood there, instruments in hand, trying to process the fact that their guitarist, their brother, was gone. Just like that. There were no grief counselors, no industry support system, no pause button on the machine they'd set in motion. GTO had radio commitments, tour dates booked, an album climbing the charts that needed promotion. So they did what artists have always done when the show must go on. They swallowed the pain, called in Roy Carter as a replacement, and kept playing. Years later, after everything else had fallen apart, Johnnie would say, "The music is my way of giving thanks to God for being alive." And you could hear the weight of that statement, the way survival and gratitude get tangled up when you've lost people along the way. But in 1977, there wasn't time to philosophize. Too Hot to Handle still went platinum, the accolades still rolled in, and Heatwave still had to smile for the cameras and pretend the cracks weren't forming. Jesse's death was the first shadow, the first whisper that maybe this dream had a price nobody had agreed to pay. And deliver they did. 1978 became the year Heatwave proved they weren't just a one-hit wonder, they were a movement. January brought Central Heating, their sophomore album, and it climbed straight to number 10 on the Billboard 200, another platinum plaque to hang on the wall. Rod Temperton was still in his pocket, writing hooks that felt effortless, melodies that stuck to your ribs like Sunday dinner. The single Always and Forever dropped in March, and it was a different kind of magic. Slower, sweeter, the kind of ballad that made couples sway in dim-lit rooms and eventually became the soundtrack to thousands of weddings. It peaked at number 18 on the Hot 100, number 2 on the R&B charts, went platinum like everything else they touched that year. By July, they were back on the dance floor with The Groove Line, a funk-driven anthem that hit number 7 on the Hot 100 and number 3 R&B. Another platinum single, another reason to believe the tragedies were behind them. The tour dates were packed, the venues were bigger, the checks were fatter. Johnnie and Keith were riding high, and for a moment it felt like Jesse's death was a fluke, a terrible accident that wouldn't repeat itself. October 1978. A party in London, the kind of industry celebration where champagne flows and everyone's pretending the pressure doesn't exist. Mario Mantese, the band's Spanish bassist who'd been holding down the low end since the beginning, left with his girlfriend after a few too many drinks and an argument that should have ended with a slammed door. Instead, it ended with a blade in his chest, his body collapsing on the pavement, his heart stopping for minutes while paramedics fought to shock him back to life. They saved him, technically. But when Mario woke up from the coma weeks later, he couldn't see, couldn't speak, couldn't move, blind and mute and paralyzed from a wound that had stolen everything but his pulse. The band visited him in the hospital, stood by his bedside staring at a man who'd been dancing on stage just weeks earlier, now trapped in a body that wouldn't respond. And in a grace that defied logic, Mario forgave his attacker, never pressed charges, chose mercy over revenge in a way that made the tragedy even heavier. Derek Bramble stepped in as the new bassist, another replacement for another ghost, and the machine kept grinding. 2 stabbings in 2 years, 2 core members gone, 1 buried and 1 breathing but absent. The press started whispering about curses, about bad luck that felt too consistent to be coincidence, about a band that couldn't catch a break no matter how many platinum records they stacked. February 1979. A highway somewhere between gigs, the kind of road Heatwave had driven 100 times before, the kind of drive that's supposed to be routine. Johnnie Wilder Jr. was behind the wheel when the van came out of nowhere, metal meeting metal in the kind of collision that doesn't leave room for luck. The impact was catastrophic. His body slammed forward, neck snapping in a way that severed the connection between brain and limbs, leaving him conscious but paralyzed from the neck down. He woke up in a hospital bed, unable to move his arms, his legs, his fingers, anything below his chin. The frontman who'd commanded stages, who'd danced under spotlights, who'd built a band on charisma and movement, now trapped in a body that wouldn't respond. Keith stood by his brother's bedside and made a vow that would define the rest of his life. He'd carry the vocals forward, keep Heatwave alive, do whatever it took to honor what they'd built together. Johnnie wasn't done either, couldn't perform, couldn't tour, but his mind was still sharp, his ear for music still intact, so he pivoted to production from a wheelchair, guiding sessions from a seated position while Keith became the face of the band. Years later, Keith would remember those studio days with a bittersweet smile, saying, "The kids loved him in the studio," talking about how Johnnie's presence still commanded respect even when he couldn't move. May 1979 brought Hot Property, the album they'd been working on before the crash, produced by Phil Ramone and featuring Derek Bramble on bass. It went gold, which in any other timeline would have been a celebration, but the momentum was bleeding out faster than they could stitch it back together. Because here's the brutal truth the industry doesn't say out loud. Disco in 1979 was about movement, about bodies on dance floors, about performers who could sweat and spin and make you believe in the groove. You couldn't tour from a wheelchair back then, not in that era, not in that genre. The live shows that had made Heatwave electric, the stage presence that had turned casual listeners into fanatics. All of it vanished overnight. 3 tragedies in 3 years. Jesse stabbed dead before the debut peaked, Mario stabbed into silence and paralysis. Johnnie paralyzed from the neck down. The hits were still on the radio, the platinum plaques were still on the walls, but the dream was done. The timing couldn't have been crueler. Just as Heatwave's lineup crumbled, so did the entire genre that had made them stars. By 1980, disco wasn't just falling out of fashion, it was being actively destroyed. Radio stations held disco demolition nights. White rock fans set vinyl on fire in stadiums, and the backlash carried the kind of racial and homophobic undertones that made it clear this wasn't just about music trends. The dance floors that had worshipped Boogie Nights and the groove line suddenly went quiet. DJs pivoting to rock and new wave, while R&B shifted toward the softer, slower sounds of Quiet Storm and the emerging new jack swing movement. Heatwave's Candles album dropped that year and peaked at a dismal number 71 on the Billboard 200, a freefall from the platinum heights they'd known just 2 years earlier. 1981 brought Current, their fifth and final album under the Epic CBS deal, and while it moved 500,000 copies, there were no hits, no radio spins, no momentum left to resurrect. The contract ended, not with a bang, but with a quiet expiration. The label moving on to the next sound, the next trend, the next act that hadn't been cursed by fate and bad timing. Keith kept touring with rotating lineups through the 80s, carrying the Heatwave name to nostalgia circuits and oldies festivals, playing the hits for crowds who remembered when disco was magic. But the albums flopped, the industry had moved on, and the spotlight had found newer, younger faces. And then there was Rod Temperton, the quiet genius who'd written every hit, who'd given Heatwave their voice. He'd already started working with Quincy Jones before the tragedies piled up, and by the time Johnnie was in a wheelchair and disco was dead, Rod was in the studio writing songs that would define the next decade. Rock With You, Thriller, Off the Wall. His pen fueled Michael Jackson's empire, earned him millions, cemented his legacy as one of the greatest songwriters of all time. And barely anyone remembered he'd started with Heatwave. The obituaries in 2016 would call him the man who wrote Thriller, not the keyboardist from that disco band. There were no villains in this story, no evil label executives or backstabbing managers, just economics, timing, and the brutal reality that the music industry doesn't wait for healing, doesn't pause for tragedies, doesn't owe you a second act when the market shifts beneath your feet. The decades that followed were quiet in the way that abandoned stages are quiet, not silent, but emptied of the noise that once mattered. Johnnie stayed in Dayton, the city he'd once been so desperate to escape, and found a different kind of purpose in gospel music. From his wheelchair, he produced tracks for local church choirs, mentored young musicians, spoke at congregations about faith and survival. He'd quote scripture the same way he used to deliver lyrics, with conviction, with soul, with the belief that his voice still mattered even if the world had stopped listening. On May 13, 2006, his family found him unresponsive at home, his body finally giving out after 27 years of fighting gravity and paralysis. He was 56 years old, and the obituaries were brief, a footnote in the disco era that had moved on without him. Rod Temperton kept working, kept writing, kept stacking royalty checks from the Michael Jackson catalog that had made him a legend in songwriter circles even as his face remained unknown. When cancer took him on October 5, 2016, at age 66, the headlines called him the man behind Thriller, and most of the tributes never even mentioned Heatwave. It was like those early years in London studios, those platinum singles, those brothers he'd built a sound with, all of it erased by the bigger, shinier legacy that came after. Keith outlived them both, carrying the Heatwave name through revival tours and oldies festivals, still singing Boogie Nights for crowds who remembered when disco wasn't a punchline. In a 2015 interview, His voice still strong despite the years, he said simply, "We kept it real and pure." And you could hear the pride mixed with the grief, the satisfaction of knowing they'd created something that mattered even if the world had forgotten how much it cost. On October 29, 2017, he died peacefully in his sleep from health complications. 65 years old, the last original voice finally silenced. 3 deaths, 3 decades apart, and yet, always and forever, still plays at weddings. Boogie Nights still fills dance floors, and a generation on YouTube is finally asking, what happened to Heatwave? The answer to that question lives in the music itself, in the way certain grooves refuse to die no matter how hard the world tries to bury them. Always and Forever became one of the most covered songs in R&B history. Luther Vandross made it his own in the 90s, and decades later, it's still racking up millions of streams. Certified multi-platinum long after the men who created it are gone. Couples still choose it for their first dance, still cry to it at anniversaries, still hold each other close while Rod Temperton's melody wraps around them like a promise. The official Boogie Nights video on YouTube has pulled in over 10 million views, proving that the groove never really left. It just waited for a new generation to find it. And they are finding it. In 2024 and 2025, documentaries titled The Band That Wouldn't Die and Rise and Fall of Heatwave started popping up on YouTube, racking up views from kids who weren't even born when disco died, who only know the music through samples and nostalgia playlists. The algorithm is doing what the industry wouldn't, keeping their story alive, asking the questions that should have been asked decades ago. Rod's Heatwave catalog became the blueprint for everything he wrote afterward. The rhythms, the chord progressions, the way he could make a hook feel effortless. Thriller doesn't exist without Boogie Nights. Michael Jackson's empire was built on lessons Rod learned in those London studios with Johnnie and Keith, back when they were just trying to make people dance. The tragedy is real. 3 men lost to violence and accidents. A band that should have ruled the 80s reduced to a cautionary tale about bad luck and worse timing. But the music outlived the tragedy, outlasted the disco backlash, outlived all 3 of them. That's the lesson Heatwave leaves behind. Talent isn't a shield, success isn't permanent, and fate doesn't care how many platinum records you've stacked. But if the groove is real, if the soul is genuine, if the music connects to something deeper than trends, it survives. Because in the end, Heatwave's story isn't about what the stabbings and crashes took away. It's about the grooves they left behind, still boogieing in the dark long after the lights went out.